By 1967, roughly 38% of American mothers with school-age children had paying jobs. That's nearly 4 in 10. You wouldn't know it from the television commercials, which still showed women in pearls raving about dishwashing liquid. You wouldn't know it from the help wanted ads either, which were still legally printed in 2 separate columns, one for men, one for women, as casually as a restaurant menu. The working mother existed in enormous numbers. She just wasn't supposed to talk about it too loudly. This is the story of those women, not the ones on the television commercials, not the ones in the magazine spreads with the perfect kitchens and the perfectly behaved children, the real ones. The ones who were up before dawn, running on percolator coffee and sheer willpower, managing 2 full-time jobs at once, and being paid properly for neither. To understand what it meant to be a working mother in 1967, you first have to understand the world she was waking up into every single morning. The United States was a country of nearly 199 million people, buzzing with a kind of restless energy. The Vietnam War was escalating, and the nightly news brought it directly into the living room through Walter Cronkite's steady, measured voice. The summer of love was just around the corner. Young people were gathering in San Francisco, burning draft cards, wearing flowers in their hair. The country was changing, loudly, visibly, unmistakably, but most working mothers weren't part of that story. They were too tired. Imagine waking up at 5:30 in the morning. The house is dark and quiet. The rest of the family is still asleep. You don't lie there for a moment savoring the silence because there is no time for that. You put on the percolator. No automatic drip machine, no programmable timer, just a stovetop pot that you have to watch, and you start moving. There is no microwave. There is no drive-through. There is no grabbing a protein bar on the way out the door. Because in 1967, a proper hot breakfast wasn't a luxury, it was an expectation. If you fed your husband cold cereal in the morning, people assumed something was wrong with you. So you cook eggs, bacon, toast, maybe oatmeal. While the percolator bubbles and the bacon sizzles, you iron your husband's shirt and your own blouse. Because permanent press fabrics, the kind that don't wrinkle in the wash, aren't widely available yet. You have a full workday ahead of you, and your shift hasn't even officially started. Here is something that often gets lost when we look back at this era. The phrase second shift, the sociological term for the unpaid domestic labor that working women performed on top of their paying jobs, wasn't coined until 1989. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild wrote the book, but the reality it described had existed for decades before anyone gave it a name. In 1967, she worked approximately 40 hours a week at her job. Then she came home and worked another 30 hours a week for free. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, grocery shopping, mending clothes, making lunches, managing the household entirely on her own, because the idea of a husband sharing domestic duties was not just rare. It was considered somewhat embarrassing for him. Men helped out occasionally. They did not participate as equals. That distinction mattered enormously. The average American home in 1967 was around 1,500 square feet. No dishwasher. That was a luxury item. No microwave. Refrigerators were smaller than today's, which meant grocery shopping couldn't be done in one massive weekly haul. She went to the store several times a week, hauling paper bags, paper, not plastic, either on the bus or in the family's second car if they were lucky enough to have one. Dinner meant meat every night. Chicken, pot roast, pork chops, something substantial made from scratch, on the table by 6 o'clock when he walked through the door. If she was exhausted from an 8-hour shift, that exhaustion was largely her problem to manage. The family still needed to eat. And yet here is the contradiction that makes this era so fascinating. Many of these women didn't experience this as oppression. They experienced it as competence, as pride. There was real satisfaction in running a household efficiently, in having the house clean and the children fed and the husband's shirts pressed. The tension wasn't between happiness and misery. It was between genuine pride in domestic skill and the grinding physical impossibility of doing everything, at a paying job, and at home, without any systemic support at all. That's what made it so hard. Before she even left the house, she faced a set of requirements that would seem almost surreal today. Getting dressed for the office was not simply a matter of putting on clothes you felt comfortable in. It was a performance with rules, specific, enforced rules. Pantyhose were mandatory in nearly every office environment. So were girdles, the tight, restrictive foundation garments designed to create a smooth, controlled silhouette. Wearing them in the peak summer heat was genuinely uncomfortable. Not wearing them could get you sent home. Some workplaces were explicit about this in their dress codes. Others simply made the expectation clear through social enforcement. If you showed up without one, somebody would let you know. Slacks were almost completely off the table. A few progressive companies were beginning to tolerate them in 1967. But for most office environments, a dress or skirt was non-negotiable. And the hair, the fashionable silhouettes of the era, the bouffant, the beehive, the carefully set waves, required sleeping in brush rollers the night before. Not comfortable rollers, hard, bristled ones that made a full night of sleep difficult. The alternative was a weekly trip to the salon, which cost both money and time she didn't really have. Many jobs had additional requirements layered on top of all of this. Airline stewardesses, a profession overwhelmingly occupied by women, operated under contracts that specified not just dress codes, but weight limits, written into the contract. If you exceeded the stated weight, you could be grounded or terminated. This was not a fringe policy. It was industry standard. She dressed herself like this 5 days a week, usually before 7:30 in the morning, after making breakfast and packing lunches and waking the children. Then she went to work. The office she walked into in 1967 was smoky, not metaphorically, literally. Smoking indoors was not only permitted, it was normal. Ashtrays sat on desks throughout the office. The air was heavy with it. She sat at an IBM typewriter, no computer, no screen. A typewriter. Mechanical, loud, demanding precision with every keystroke, because there was no backspace that fixed anything cleanly. Correction fluid existed. Liquid paper had been invented in the 1950s by a woman named Bet Nesmith Graham, but using it was slow and imprecise. The men in the room called her and her female colleagues the girls. Not as an insult, not consciously anyway. It was just the word. She might be 34 years old, a mother of 3, managing her household budget with military efficiency. She was still one of the girls. And if her male manager brushed against her at the filing cabinet or made a comment about her figure or asked her to stay after hours in a way that made her uncomfortable, there was no term for that yet. Sexual harassment wasn't legally defined until 1976, nearly a decade away. In 1967, it was simply the workplace, a hazard you navigated, a problem you managed by keeping your head down and not making a scene. Now here is something that often surprises people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had already passed by the time we're talking about. Title VII of that act technically prohibited workplace discrimination based on sex. So weren't women protected? In theory, yes. In practice, barely. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, was new, underfunded, and widely considered to view sex discrimination as a secondary concern. When women filed complaints about discriminatory practices, they were frequently dismissed or deprioritized. The law existed. The enforcement was almost non-existent, which is why you could still open a newspaper in 1967 and find the Help Wanted section divided into 2 columns. Help Wanted, male. Help Wanted, female. Management positions, trade jobs, higher-paying roles, men's section, secretarial work, nursing, retail clerking, women's section. The glass ceiling wasn't invisible. It was printed in black and white every morning in every major newspaper in the country. Let's talk about what she was actually being paid for all of this. In 1967, the median annual earnings for a full-time male worker was approximately $7,182. For a woman doing full-time work, it was around $4,150. She was earning roughly 58 cents for every dollar her male colleague took home. But the economic reality went deeper than that raw number. There was a widely held, openly stated belief in business and banking circles that a woman's income was pin money, supplemental income, secondary income, money for little luxuries on top of a man's real salary. Her wages were not considered a living wage by design. They were designed to be insufficient on their own, which conveniently kept women financially dependent and made it harder to leave a bad marriage or to refuse a bad working situation. The minimum wage in 1967 was $1.40 an hour, and many of the jobs most accessible to women, secretarial work, retail, textile factory positions, clustered near that floor. A woman who was a skilled typist, managing correspondence for an entire department, might earn a fraction of what the manager she typed for was making. There was no legal mechanism to challenge this on the basis of equal pay in any truly effective way. And then there was the credit problem. If she wanted to open a credit card account, most banks required her husband's signature. If she wanted a mortgage, a business loan, or even a personal loan, she generally needed a male co-signer, a husband, a father, a brother. It didn't matter what her income was. It didn't matter how long she'd been employed or how reliably she paid her bills. She was not considered a credit-worthy individual in her own right. This wasn't a backroom policy. It was standard practice, openly acknowledged, and it wouldn't be challenged effectively until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, 7 years away. In 1967, a woman who wanted to leave her marriage had to reckon with the fact that she might not be able to rent an apartment, finance a car, or open a bank account without a man's permission. Financial independence wasn't just difficult. For many women, it was structurally impossible. Here's the question modern audiences always ask first: who was watching the kids? The answer in 1967 is complicated, and for many families, it is genuinely heartbreaking. Formal daycare as we understand it today, licensed facilities with trained staff, regulated ratios of caregivers to children, government oversight, was essentially non-existent as a mainstream institution. What daycare centers did exist were sparse, expensive, and socially stigmatized. Sending your child to daycare was widely seen as a sign that something had gone wrong in the family. Troubled families sent their kids to daycare. Good mothers didn't need to, so she improvised. She relied on her own mother or her mother-in-law or a neighbor who stayed home and was willing to take a few extra dollars in cash to watch one more child. She relied on older siblings to care for younger ones after school. She relied, with a degree of trust that would seem alarming today, on her children simply being home alone. The term latchkey kid, a child who comes home from school to an empty house, wearing the house key on a string around their neck, was born entirely out of this necessity. It wasn't a failure of parenting. It was a reflection of a world in which two incomes were increasingly necessary, and the infrastructure to support that reality hadn't been built yet. If a child got sick on a school day, the calculation was immediate and brutal. Who stays home? In almost every case, it was the mother. Not because the father was unwilling in every household, though in many he simply was, but because the mother's job was considered the secondary one, the one you could miss, the income you could sacrifice for a day, even when that income was the difference between making rent and not making rent. She had no maternity leave to plan around either. There was no Family and Medical Leave Act. That wouldn't exist for another 26 years. If she became pregnant again, the standard practice at most companies was to ask her to resign, quietly, before she started to show. The official reasoning was that a visibly pregnant woman was inappropriate in the professional environment. The real reasoning was simpler. She would need time off eventually, and the company didn't want to deal with it. Many women hid their pregnancies as long as their clothing would allow. A well-chosen shift dress could buy a few extra weeks, but eventually the conversation happened, Clean out your desk. We wish you well. While her male colleagues went to the diner down the street for lunch, lingering over coffee and maybe a business conversation that would, incidentally, cement a professional relationship or lead to an opportunity she'd never hear about. She was running errands. There were no ATMs in 1967. If she needed to deposit her paycheck, she went to the bank during business hours, which meant her lunch break. There were no online pharmacies. If her child needed a prescription refilled, she called from a payphone, dropping a dime, and then picked it up during the lunch hour. There was no grocery delivery. Shopping happened in whatever cracks of time she could find, which frequently meant stopping at the store on the way home from work in her office clothes, hauling bags onto the bus or into the car. Her time was never entirely her own, not at home, not at work, and not in the small gaps between the two. Every minute had a claim on it. The men around her who seemed to advance more quickly, who seemed to have more energy at the end of the day, who seemed to have more time for the professional socializing that opened doors. They weren't working harder. They simply had wives at home handling everything else. She left the office at 5 or 5:30, and the second shift began the moment she walked through the front door. Dinner had to be made. Not assembled. Made. From ingredients. A meat-centered meal, because in 1967, a dinner without a protein centerpiece wasn't really dinner. She would cook while still in her work clothes, or she would change quickly and then cook. Her husband arrived home and read the newspaper. Walter Cronkite came on at 6:30 and the living room fell quiet. She served dinner, cleared the table, washed the dishes by hand. If they had children in school, there was homework to supervise. There was no collapsing on the couch to decompress in front of something meaningless on her phone. Television was an option, but the shows available were limited, and the television itself was shared family property in the living room. Her time and attention after dinner were not really hers to claim. She did laundry. She prepared for the next day, laying out clothes, checking that the children's things were ready, thinking through logistics. And then, sometime around 10:30, she set her hair in brush rollers so the bouffant would hold its shape for work the next morning. She did this even when she was exhausted, especially when she was exhausted, because the alternative, showing up to work with hair that wasn't properly done, was its own kind of professional liability. Then she went to sleep, to wake at 5:30 and do it again. Here's the question nobody asks often enough. How did she manage it? The honest answer involves several things. Coffee. Enormous amounts of coffee. The social bonds of other women in similar situations navigated quietly because this wasn't an era when you openly complained about your husband's lack of domestic participation, community, routine, a kind of iron competence born of having no other option, and increasingly, medication. The pharmaceutical industry had noticed the stressed American housewife, and now the stressed working mother, and had a solution. Minor tranquilizers, particularly Valium, were being prescribed to women in staggering numbers during this era. The Rolling Stones would later sing about Mother's Little Helper in 1966, the little yellow pill that got you through the day. It was barely even coded language. Doctors prescribed these medications largely without question as a management tool for the impossible pressure their female patients described in the consulting room. The mental health system didn't say, your life is structured in an unsustainable way and society needs to change. It said, here is something to take the edge off. Sleep deprivation was chronic, structural, expected. You were tired because you were supposed to be tired. That was just what this life looked like. But here is what we also have to say honestly. Not every woman in this position was miserable. That is just as important to understand. Many women found genuine meaning in their jobs. A woman working as a teacher or a nurse in 1967 was doing work that mattered, work she was good at, work that gave her an identity and a sense of competence beyond the domestic sphere. Many found deep pride in the fact that their paycheck was helping the family buy a house, send children to better schools, afford a second car, or build some small financial cushion. The reasons women went to work in 1967 were overwhelmingly practical. The drive for a slightly better life, the desire to enter or maintain the middle class, and many of them felt proud of that contribution, even if it was never quite named or celebrated out loud. The frustration wasn't that they were working. It was that they were working twice as hard as the men around them for less money, with less protection, less credit, less power, and less support. And everyone around them was pretending that was simply the natural order of things. Modern audiences tend to fall into one of two nostalgic traps when they look at 1967. The first is the golden age myth, that one income was plenty back then, that a man's salary bought the house, the car, the family vacation, the comfortable suburban life, and that adding a working mother to the picture was simply a lifestyle choice. The numbers don't support this. The average family income in 1967 was around $8,000 a year, roughly equivalent to $73,000 today. Average home prices were around $24,600. On paper, that sounds manageable. But the standard of living that income bought was significantly lower than what Americans expect today. Homes were half the size. Families ate out rarely, if ever. Clothes were mended and worn until they wore out, not replaced seasonally. The reason mothers were entering the workforce in growing numbers wasn't ambition. It was inflation, rising consumer expectations, and the quiet arithmetic of wanting a slightly better life for their children than they'd had themselves. The second myth runs in the opposite direction, that every woman in 1967 was secretly miserable, waiting for the feminist movement to arrive and liberate her from a life of domestic imprisonment. This is equally untrue. Many women found deep satisfaction in the domestic skills they'd mastered, genuine love for the home they'd built, and real pride in their children's well-being. The friction wasn't a simple story of oppression and longing. It was more human than that. It was the story of women who were good at two things: being mothers and being workers, and who lived in a society that gave them credit for neither fully, supported them in neither practically, and somehow expected them to keep smiling through all of it. Something else was happening in 1967 that the women living through it couldn't entirely see yet. The participation of mothers in the workforce was rising steadily, from 21.6% in 1950 to 26.3% in 1955 to 30.4% in 1960 and 38% by 1967. Each year, quietly, incrementally higher. No one had organized this. No one had campaigned for it. It was the invisible motion of millions of individual families making the same economic calculation independently, arriving at the same answer: we need her income. What they were doing, without a roadmap or any institutional support, was proving something: that it could be done, that a mother could hold a job and raise children and keep a household running. They were doing it badly, in the sense that the system made it nearly impossible to do well, but they were doing it. And the sheer accumulating weight of those 38% was going to make certain arguments about women's natural place in the home increasingly difficult to sustain. The Equal Pay Act had passed in 1963, the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Second-wave feminism was gathering momentum. The EEOC, however toothless it seemed in 1967, was a new institution that was learning to use its power. The women's movement that would transform American law and culture in the 1970s was not born from nowhere. It was born, at least in part, from the lived experience of the women who had spent the 1960s running 2 shifts a day and watching the newspaper divide the world in half. She didn't know she was building something. She was too tired for grand historical consciousness. She was thinking about what to make for dinner and whether she had enough money in her account to cover the electric bill without her husband's signature on a form at the bank. But she was building something anyway. Here is what 1967 really was for a working mother. It was the percolator bubbling at 5:30 in the morning while the rest of the house was quiet. It was the brush rollers she slept in every night, and the girdle she put on every morning, and the newspaper she couldn't bring home too many groceries on the bus to read. It was making a hot dinner after an 8-hour shift, and washing the dishes by hand, and setting her alarm and doing it all again tomorrow. It was raising children in a world that had not built any infrastructure to help her do so. It was earning 58 cents on the dollar and having no legal avenue to demand more. It was keeping a family afloat and never quite getting credit for how. But it was also something else. It was competence, adaptation, a quiet, grinding, unacknowledged form of strength that didn't announce itself because there was no time for announcements. The women of 1967 didn't have a vocabulary yet for what they were experiencing, or a political movement that had fully arrived to name it. What they had was each other, quietly. The neighbor who watched the kids for cash. The woman at the next typewriter who always covered when you needed to leave 5 minutes early to catch the bus. The mother-in-law who came on Tuesdays. The tiny, informal networks of mutual support that held everything together because nothing official had been built yet. We look back at 1967 sometimes with something like envy. The prices, the simplicity, the sense of a world that moved more slowly. And in some ways, it was simpler. But not for her. For her, the world was asking more than it had any right to ask, and she was meeting that demand every single day invisibly before most of us had even had our first cup of coffee. The working mother of 1967 didn't just survive. She built the world that made it easier for every woman who came after her. She just never got to see the blueprints.